We are 9 weeks away from the Rubicon trip and once again, vastly underprepared. In my defense, I did try to get this thing rolling a little bit sooner, and I have been ordering parts for about 6 months and really nothing has shown up yet. My rebuilt engine came back a couple months ago, but I couldn't do much with it because I've been waiting on the drivetrain, and that just arrived at an airport yesterday. So I just need to take some time this week and go out and make the 8-hour round trip to go get all of that. Obviously, the Jeep starts with the M151 drivetrain in it, so I need to go through and reverse everything I've done. So things like the gas pedal that's been modified, the transmission tunnel, wiring's going to need redone. We got to cut the old motor mounts out, put in the factory style motor mounts, all kinds of little details. And I'll go through that a little bit with the video. Now this video quality is not going to be very good because I'm using my cell phone. That's because the main camera sitting on a tripod fell over, shattered the lens. I mean, it's out at Nikon getting rebuilt, so we'll hopefully have that in a few weeks. But as for right now, we need to get on the project. So my original plan of the Submarine was to use the F-head engine, which is an overhead valve version of the factory flathead. And then I was going to run the T98 transmission, which it's essentially the same 3-speed that's already in the Jeep, but it has a deeper first gear, like a granny low, and that's why the transmission is so much taller than the rest of them. Then I got to thinking, my dream Jeep is really something with the V6 or V8. I don't know if I want to spend the money in rebuilding an F-head engine if I'm going to end up taking out in the near future. What I've done here is got 2 birds with 1 stone. So the green Jeep that this engine's out of, the whole drivetrain's lived a really, really rough life. I mean, absolutely abused and overheated and thrown in the mud and the water, and so she was overdue for a rebuild and smoking, the whole 9 yards. So I sent this out to get rebuilt. When I was pulling out this engine, I thought, well, we'll take the overdrive from that Jeep, put it in the sub too for this trip. That'd be really nice. But I found that my overdrive was actually extremely worn out, and to buy the parts for the overdrive almost cost as much as just buying a whole new one. It would be really, really nice if I could have the extra low gears in the transfer case. You can buy the tear low gears from Herm. They're discontinued elsewhere, but he's remanufacturing them. I thought, well, that'd be way easier going through the Rubicon Trail because you can just creep right along, especially without the whole power steering situation. And I was like, well, if I'm buying a new overdrive and a new transfer case, let's start looking at his transmission setup. A T18 transmission, you can see right there on the case. It's essentially the same exact thing as the T98. So why in the world would I buy this T18 when I already had the T98 sitting around? Well, it's pretty simple. I did not realize that the T98 transmission, you cannot buy parts from. Yes, you can get bearings and seals, etc., but you can't get new gears and shafts, things of that nature. And one thing I don't like about the Willys transmissions is that when they wear out, they pop out a second gear, which on this transmission would actually be third gear. That even if it's a little worn, it's not going to pop out a gear on you. And that's extremely important to me, especially on your big, tall hills. It pops out a gear, you lose your engine braking, you're in trouble. I end up really, really liking this drivetrain. All I need to do is replace the engine. I pull this out, put it in the green Jeep because it needed a rebuilt engine anyways. And then I'll get another flathead or an overhead valve for the Submarine. And if I decide, well, this setup's really cool, but I still want something with the V8, I take this whole drivetrain out and put it in the green Jeep because that thing, its transmission still needs rebuilt, the transfer case. This is technically the overdrive off of it. The axles need gone through. So this is one step into mechanically restoring the other Jeep. And then I can still do my dream with the Submarine. So we've got just about everything we need for the swap from Herm. He's got the oak spacers that drop the factory skid plate down about 1 inch. We're going to make metal ones instead. We've got all the shifter pieces and the mounts and all that kind of stuff. And then I also did opt out for a full floating axle kit, which I'll show more of that later. So that's essentially the dream setup right there. Quick update on the sub. I have the drivetrain preliminary installed. The only problem I had is the engine was sitting a little crooked towards the driver's side. So all I've done is added some washers, or I should say some shims, to push that side of the engine up. Now the only issue that I'm having right now is the throttle linkage is sort of binding on the body back here. And another issue we had is I was accidentally sent the wrong transfer case adapter for the T98, which this is actually a T18 transmission. So the problem is this adapter is for a Scout. You can see my dilemma right here with having the wrong adapter. Even with the oak spacers on the transmission mount, the transfer case is hanging below it. What I found is that the Scout adapter has 6 more degrees of clocking than the Jeep one. So I believe a Jeep is about 20 degrees, the Scout is 26 degrees. So by the time you figure out the radius after clocking the transfer case, at the yoke itself, this sits about 1.5 inches lower than what it should be. So with the Jeep adapter, it's going to bring it right back up to where it should be. All I'm going to have to do is continue grinding on this little section because I'm sure it's going to hit the transmission itself. We're going to give this a coat of paint, and then by the time that stuff's done, the new parts should arrive and we can keep this train rolling. Here's a flat fender tech tip for everyone out there. To the left we have a standard CJ2A differential cover, M38, and MB/GPW. So what you're going to notice is the CJ2A diff cover is extremely thin, and that's a problem with a lot of older vehicles is all the differential covers and transmission covers, all that kind of stuff, so thin that they warp very easily, they leak, they don't hold up well. Alright, to the left is the CJ, right M38. You're going to notice how paper thin that is compared to the M38 differential cover. This is a lot thicker setup, a lot stronger. The one on the right is going to be a lot better for doing rock crawling, things that are going to be smashing the front end because it's so much thicker that it's not going to break nearly as easy. Now if you thought that was thick, wait till you see the World War II one. This one is actually heavy to hold. You can see that this one is about the thickness of both of those put together. The MB/GPW one is extremely heavy duty. The only thing you're going to notice about this World War II cover is that it's cast iron, and I believe this is just regular stamped steel, same with that. So you always have to be wary of cast iron cracking under certain conditions versus steel that might be easier to bend. I was in the process of tearing apart the Submarine's front axle, that way we can get this thing out of here and get the painted one in ready to rock. And I cannot believe just how trash these wheel bearings are. I mean, it'll hardly spin around. You know, even with giving my best effort, you hear the grinding. It's just absolutely trash. And what sucks is I fully serviced these. Wow, look at that. Oh, it spun a bearing. Right on the spindle. Wow, so it actually spun the bearing. That's not good. Well, anyways, I fully serviced these things the day before I took it out in the water. And yes, it did sit after we did all that. But everything is pretty much trashed. So it's just a little demotivating for playing out in the water in the mud. Here's a closer look at a T98 transmission crossmember. All this is a factory like late CJ2A, CJ3A, but you weld this bracket onto the back side. All this does is extend the flat part of the crossmember back about, I'd say around 2 inches or so. And these are the 2 bolt holes for the bracket that connects to the adapter between the transmission and the transfer case. The holes right here, I'm assuming, are just for strength. You're going to notice mine has a square welded in right here. This is because I was given this bracket by an aftermarket company, but the bolt holes were wrong and they were so far off that I actually completely cut them out and welded a new piece with my own holes put in there. And then that's what it kind of looks like from the underside. Obviously mine has a welded in patch, but not too much going on right there. Here's one of the most important parts about the T98 setup in a Willys Jeep. Now from the factory you'd be given the correct clutch linkages, but if you buy the stuff aftermarket there's really nothing out there. So as the transmission is physically wider, you have to shorten this crossover tube because there's not enough room between the frame rail and the transmission. So I shortened that, I believe, somewhere around 1.5 inches in the center, and then I knocked a little bit off the edges right here just to get everything lined up, because you want this part lined up to the pedal shaft area, and then you want this lined up to the actual fork in the transmission. Now you're not going to get this perfectly lined up straight because the transmission actually comes out pretty far in the middle, and this would hit if it was perfectly straight. So I think it sits a little bit crooked like that, but since it's a cable it doesn't really matter. So this is a stock Jeep part. This is also a stock Jeep part. Well, it started out. So this cable for the clutch, originally there are threads that end right about here, and then you have your yoke on it. So what I did to extend it backwards is I took some solid 3/8 24 fine thread rod, and I added a little bit of length. It goes about right there on the inside. So what I did is I took a piece of tubing, put it on the mill, and I drilled 4 holes through it. 2 for the new thread, 2 for the old thread, and that is, through both sides. So that way, yes, you can weld this part of the tube onto the threads right there and the threads right here, but I wanted some strength in the center, so that was the purpose of drilling those holes. That way you could weld straight to the threads on the tube right there. It makes it a little bit stronger, and then of course we have enough thread right here to adjust the yoke in and out. Now this right here on a stock Jeep, that is just one solid rod. That is a rod that goes from the actual clutch pedal backwards into this cross shaft. Now on a stock Jeep, this is just all solid. There's no adjustment right there. But because this is more of a game of guess and check, I wanted to have adjustment here and here as well. So that's why I've got yokes on both ends. And then I welded a nut onto this tube. That way I could spin this easily, because over time as things get rusty, maybe you can't just slide these yokes by hand anymore. So I want to be able to grab onto the tube right there. So I think I've got about 3 inches of play between this rod and this rod for clutch adjustment, which is great. I had to yank the master cylinder out of the Jeep because the banjo bolt on the side is actually contacting the engine. So I yanked this out, that way I could grind down the bracket to set this thing down lower. And what I found is that even the master cylinder is corroded on this Jeep. If you look inside the cap right here, it's all corrosion. I actually had rust around the rubber ring right here, and it's a little rusty, and the fluid was just disgusting in there. Keep in mind, if you're going to dunk your Jeep in the mud and the water, everything's going to get destroyed.